Hello and welcome to the December webinar from the IIA Clean Coal Centre. My name is Benedicte Brox and I'm Communications Officer at the IEACCC. Our monthly webinars are based on our technical reports, which are available from our website www.iea-coal.org. Residents of member countries and employees of sponsoring organizations can download our reports at no charge after a one-off registration. Please visit our website for details. The subject for today's webinar is an update on public outreach for carbon capture and storage projects. The report on this topic will be out for peer review shortly and will be published in the first quarter of 2017. I will now give this to my colleague Toby Lockwood.
Thank you, Benedicte, and hello everyone. So this webinar will be on my report on public outreach for carbon capture and storage, which, as Benedicte said, should be out. It's currently out in draft form and should be published and available from our website shortly. So to begin, since the failure of a few early CCS demonstration projects due to strong public opposition, the developers of most new projects have been very aware of the need for a highly effective communication strategy for gaining acceptance from local communities. This aspect of CCS projects is variously referred to as communication, outreach or engagement for the public, or more broadly, stakeholders, and recognises the need to go well beyond the consultation activities required by the formal regulatory process and acquire a so-called social licence to operate. In this webinar, I will discuss some of the public concerns about CCS and review the basic principles and techniques which have been developed to help improve public engagement before looking at the strategies adopted by a number of CCS project case studies from around the world. Public knowledge or understanding of CCS is generally very low, apart from in regions which have seen significant CCS activity or high-profile opposition. Consequently, simple surveys of public opinion on the technology tend to reveal only unstable pseudo-opinions which are easily changed and not particularly informative. Many attitude studies instead provide participants with some material on CCS in order to assess more informed opinions. Among groups with no connection to an actual project, CCS is usually seen as a less desirable option for low-carbon energy than renewable energy sources or demand reduction, but also does not elicit particularly strong opposition of the kind which is sometimes seen for nuclear power. Some of the leading concerns about the technology centre around the perception that it's a quick fix or unsustainable solution which does not address the root cause of CO2 emissions, but merely allows fossil fuel-oriented companies to continue business as usual. Along these lines, unfavourable analogies are drawn with waste and nuclear waste disposal. The prospect of a CO2 leak generally appears more likely to the public than to scientists, with the dual effect of both negating the purpose of the technology and posing a risk to human health. This can be compounded by ideas that CO2 may be toxic or even explosive. For communities faced with an actual CCS project in their vicinity, fears of a CO2 leak may become heightened and are combined with many concerns which are common to other large infrastructure projects relating to reduced property value, increased traffic, noise or emissions of other pollutants or water contaminants. On the other hand, some communities have perceived benefits from nearby CCS projects which can represent an economic boost to an area, a means of prolonging flagging coal, gas or oil industries, or a symbol of global scientific prestige for the area. Some studies have concluded that such benefits can be more significant drivers of public acceptance than perceived risks. Environmental groups are relatively trusted sources of information in their field which can play an important role in shaping public opinion. A few large NGOs have taken quite strong stances against CCS, particularly for coal power, with Greenpeace and the US-based Sierra Club amongst the most notable. These organisations again frame the technology as an unsustainable prop to the fossil fuel industry which diverts funds from development of renewable energy, while highlighting high costs, slow progress of CCS deployment and technical difficulties, real or otherwise. Meanwhile, a number of environmental NGOs have actively supported the deployment of CCS, with a group of 11 forming the CCS network, a few of which I've listed here. Some other large environmental NGOs have taken a more nuanced stance of accepting forms of CCS depending on the nature of the project. So to illustrate some of these concerns and their potential far-reaching ramifications, I will start by looking at the most well-known incidents of public opposition to CCS. The Barendrecht project in the Netherlands has attained an infamous status as one of the first and arguably the only full-scale CCS project to have been halted entirely due to public opposition, and is therefore the starting point for many discussions of public outreach failures. Shell's 2007 plan to take 1 megatons per year of already high purity CO2 from a hydrogen plant near Rotterdam and store it under the nearby towns of Barendrecht and Albrandswaard was initially seen as technically straightforward and posing no special risk to the public. When the project was presented to local authorities, they were immediately concerned by the appearance that it would proceed regardless of their objections. Following an unsuccessful and probably overly technical initial public hearing, the residents of Barendrecht, under which most of the storage area lay, also became concerned about the danger of a CO2 leak and the effect on property values in the area. Although the project was largely driven by government policy to promote CCS demonstration, the national government was not visible at this stage, and the project was widely seen purely as a profit-making venture on the part of Shell. During 2009, measures were taken to improve relations, including the opening of an information centre in the town and house visits by government ministers, but much of this activity was simply dismissed as propaganda. While the national government withdrew some of the permitting powers of local authorities, a local activist group, No to CO2, was formed, but a decision to proceed with the project was nevertheless made in late 2009 amidst much public outcry. With negative national media coverage escalating, the project became a toxic political issue in the run-up to national elections and was duly cancelled by the incoming government. As a result of these events, there is an effective moratorium on onshore CO2 storage in the Netherlands. Around the same time as this drama unfolded in the Netherlands, passions were also beginning to run high over CCS in neighbouring Germany. With all political parties and many NGOs supportive of the technology in 2009, prospects for the technology appeared initially very favourable, but rapidly collapsed due to opposition from the public and a number of state governments. Much of this uprising has been traced to early plans by the utility RWE for a plant in North Rhine-Westphalia to send CO2s to a storage site in neighbouring state Schleswig-Holstein, a rural area with little connection to the coal industry. He felt surprised and poorly informed about the proposal. Helped by strong support from Greenpeace and German NGO Bund, distrust in the industry and landowner opposition spread around the country, including to Brandenburg, where the now well-known Jansfaber demonstration had been proposed at an existing coal plant. Despite much more concerted early outreach efforts on behalf of the developers of this project, Vattenfall, the negative climate for CCS did not help gain acceptance at the storage site, which was in a rural, picturesque area with strong community feeling. Concerns here centred on the risk of CO2 leaks, water contamination, land seizure, and the loss of tourism and regional reputation. Although Brandenburg, which is a heavily coal-dependent state, continued to support CCS, the opposition of other states in the national parliament blocked the passage of the EU's CCS directive into German law and put an end to Jansfaber, eventually resulting in a severely weakened form of the law which effectively prevented future onshore demonstration projects in the country. So less well known than these events, similar problems on a much smaller scale are also faced by the early proposal for a CCS demonstration at PGE's Belkazov plant in Poland, coal plant. Here, early geophysical survey work at one of the proposed storage sites was met with strong opposition by residents and local authorities. Early efforts by PGE to engage the affected communities did not manage to reach all the relevant authorities, and the contractor undertaking the work was unclear about the reason for their activities. Perhaps most significantly, a local NGO with a strong interest in using the subsurface for geothermal energy was active in orchestrating opposition and gaining media exposure. Apparently this activist sign reads, "Once they pump CO2 under the ground, there will be no seeds," demonstrating a strong feeling against the perceived industrialisation of the area. PGE learnt from this to conduct more careful engagement at another site, shown on the left here, although the project was eventually cancelled largely for financial reasons. A number of common themes can be seen in some of these early struggles for CCS in Europe. Firstly, it's clear that many project developers are not prepared for the scale of their action, seeing the technology as unremarkable and not requiring of any particularly special engagement strategy. Secondly, the fact that all these countries were going through the process of implementing the EU CCS directive presented an image of a risky, unregulated new technology, which while also allowing it to become a highly political issue. In this context, a stronger voice was needed from national governments on the need for CCS in meeting climate targets. Lastly, particularly strong anti-fossil fuel sentiments from some NGOs were prevalent in the region at the time. In response to these European missteps, as well as somewhat more successful experiences with community engagement for projects in the USA and Australia, a number of organisations have drawn up guidelines for best practice in CCS outreach work. Firstly, it is important to understand the social context of the site as much as possible, including local demographics and attitudes towards CCS, and identification of key stakeholders such as local authorities, environmental groups and landowners who will have particular influence in the community. This can make use of surveys or focus groups and will ideally inform the site selection itself to some extent. A dedicated communications team should be set up as a fully integrated part of the project and include a diverse mix of experts in communications as well as technical areas, representatives of the local community and other more neutral organisations such as research institutes. Most importantly, outreach needs to begin as early as possible, usually in an informal fashion and certainly before the regulatory requirement for public consultation or when the project features in other media. Communication should not be one-way or passive in nature, but encourage community participation and feedback, with concerns and inputs seen to be addressed by the project. Clear messages need to be tailored to various stakeholder audiences and should emphasise positive outcomes of the project, as well as openly discussing risks. As we have seen, the nature of the CCS project and the local area will also have a huge influence on attitudes to the projects and the relative success of any outreach campaign. Most significantly, by removing the perceived threat of CO2 leaks from communities, offshore CO2 storage does not generally elicit particularly strong opposition. While enhanced oil recovery projects tend to be frowned upon by some NGOs, local communities already familiar with the oil industry are not generally concerned by the practice and may even support prolongation of a local industry. Retrofit projects to existing power plants are also clearly much less objectionable than those requiring entirely new facilities, and again, such communities often wish to help preserve a local power or coal mining industry. Research-based projects, which are often smaller scale or shorter duration anyway, cause fewer issues than those operated by commercial entities. Finally, the importance of building and maintaining stakeholder trust in developers cannot be overemphasised and is a prerequisite if any outreach work is to be effective. As we have seen at Barendrecht, once trust is lost, it can be almost impossible to regain. Research organisations and NGOs are generally much more trusted than large companies, so should be involved in communication activities where possible. A policy of transparency over project uncertainties and risk is also valuable for building trust. A successful campaign will make use of a range of methods and communication materials selected on the basis of target audience and timing. For early contact with key stakeholders and landowners or responding to particularly concerned residents, it is difficult to substitute for face-to-face meetings and house visits. For introducing details of the project to a wider community audience, exhibition-style meetings with various information stands have been preferred to traditional town hall presentations to a crowd, as they allow more one-to-one communication and prevent the group being swayed by a few vocal opponents, as appeared to happen at Barendrecht. These exhibits can also be used to tour communities, set up permanently in a community centre, or attend popular local events in order to reach the maximum number of people. Larger audiences can be reached through literature distribution, advertising in local media, or the project website, which is a useful platform for content such as videos and animations of the process. Being able to easily receive feedback from the community is equally as important as getting the message out and can be best encouraged through open house sessions, readily available contact details, or a community liaison officer with good connections within the community. Beyond the description of CCS itself, most effective outreach has been obliged to provide background on climate change and the nature of CO2 itself to deal with people's concerns and back up arguments for the technology. Some other interesting observations from project experience include the realization that schematics of the storage process, which aren't drawn to scale, like the one on the left here, can cause alarm, as the CO2 appears much closer to the surface than it really is, as shown in the more appropriate right-hand image from Boundary Dam's Aquastore outreach. Issues have also been raised with technical language with unwanted connotations among the public. Most famously, some have tried to replace the use of saline aquifer with saline formation in order to avoid associations with contaminating water supplies. Many projects have included elements of outreach to education institutions, such as running science workshops and climate change or CCS at local school classes. Particularly once the project is operating, working relationships with students and researchers can also be developed. Working with local businesses and ensuring their services are used as much as possible is another effective strategy for gaining acceptance, while investment in beneficial community projects is a standard practice of many large infrastructure projects. So now we will take a look at some of the projects which have tried to put some of these ideas into practice, often with much more success. Staying in Europe, some of the most active outreach work has been conducted by these two projects, arguably due to their respective close connections to the problems at Barendrecht. Recently emerged from a period on hold and not yet received a final investment decision, the Road Coal Power Project is the only active CCS project remaining in the EU and conducted a highly considered outreach campaign during 2010 and 2011. Although helped by the offshore storage site, the project is careful to establish a trained communications team and promote cooperation with local authorities, business groups and research organisations. More recently, Shell's plan to retrofit carbon capture to Peterhead gas-fired power plant in Scotland conducted even more extensive outreach work, despite the relatively uncontroversial nature of the project. Notable features include a scheme to train local businesses to project standard, workshops run with local schools, and a countrywide advertising campaign, which we will see more of later. Every effort was made to gather feedback and address community concerns, most of which related to potential impacts on the local environment, increased construction traffic. Peterhead was strongly supported by the local community and the Scottish Government until its surprise cancellation by the UK Government late last year, or late 2015. So a pair of similar small-scale CO2 storage research pilots provide evidence that even onshore storage in Europe can win public acceptance. Spain's Ceudan Research Centre devised a comprehensive outreach strategy and used a trained communications team to engage the village of Hontamin, where their storage pilot was based, rapidly turning initial suspicion to support through active participation in community events and emphasising the economic benefits. This team were also successful in the more challenging task of winning support at the proposed onshore storage site for Endesa's Compostilla demonstration nearby, although this project did not proceed. Even in Germany, the Ketzin pilot project near Berlin operated from 2008 to 2013 without objection. In this case, there was arguably less communication than provided by Vattenfall for Jungsvelde, but the research nature, small scale and industrial history of the town all seemed to work in the project's favour, as well as early outreach before any site was formally selected. Turning to the USA now, which leads the world in deployment of large-scale CCS, but has also not been without its own misjudged public outreach campaigns in the early days of the technology. BP's short-lived plan for a new IGCC plant with enhanced oil recovery in Carson, a suburb of Los Angeles, home to several oil refineries, demonstrates how CCS is not always an easier sell to an industrialized area. Despite significant efforts to engage ethnic minority groups in the area, initial concerns over conventional air pollutants were driven by environmental justice NGOs concerned with disproportionate infliction of pollution on such groups. Late engagement and again regulatory uncertainty over CCS in the state also contributed to discontent, although the project's eventual cancellation was due to the unsuitability of the local oil field for enhanced oil recovery. I'll briefly mention Greenville, Ohio, a proposal to sequester CO2 from a bioethanol plant which faced strong opposition from the public and a local activist group known as Citizens Against Sequestration. Here, a combination of climate change denial and low levels of trust in the government and scientists made a challenging task for outreach and probably represents a site that could have been ruled out early on these grounds. Although eventually cancelled for cost reasons, the well-known first FutureGen IGCC project represents a relative triumph for public outreach and acceptance. With various sites bidding to host the project in a Department of Energy-run competition, a sense of pride was fostered in the eventual winner, the town of Mattoon in Illinois, which saw the project favourably as an economic boon, support for the state coal industry and a research project of international prestige. This support was fostered by the private consortium developing the project, which maintained a strong presence in the community, held public meetings well before the regulatory procedure, and used the State Geological Survey as an external trusted expert. When the project had to be moved elsewhere in the state as FutureGen 2.0, engaging new landowners with less connection to the project posed more of a challenge, although this second incarnation was also to fall short of the necessary investment. No overview of CCS demonstrations would be complete without mention of Boundary Dam, the first coal power CCS project which has been operating in Saskatchewan, Canada since 2014. Although a power plant retrofit and primarily EOR storage project, extensive outreach was conducted particularly for Aquistore, a research-based project to store the CO2 not used for EOR in a deep saline aquifer. A diverse communications team, including a number of research groups, held early meetings with landowners, local authorities and NGOs, and successful open house sessions for the general public. The plant has adopted an admirable level of transparency over technical issues, with a view to encouraging CCS deployment elsewhere, but consequently attracted some bad press and political attention over early operational problems and unfavourable cost comparisons with gas power. This illustrates the need for care when operating with high levels of transparency. Operational for just over a year, the Quest CCS project at the Scotford Upgrader in Canada's tar sands represents another example of Shell's thorough approach to CCS outreach since the Barrenjoey experience. With a long pipeline and saline aquifer storage in a farming area not used to industry, this project arguably posed a greater challenge than Peterhead, but has gained good acceptance. Working with the Pembina NGO and local governments, Shell made serious efforts to reach as much of the affected communities as possible, including some novel methods such as showing up at local cafes to present and discuss the project. Quest also uses a community advisory panel of local leaders and residents to review the CO2 monitoring programme and help build trust in the programme. Japan's recently launched Amaka project is a relatively large full-chain CCS demonstration with capture from an oil refinery and saline aquifer storage just offshore. Lots of outreach work has been conducted by Japan CCS, the public-private partnership set up to promote development of the technology in the country. Interactive exhibits were set up at a number of community locations such as a shopping centre and local government offices. Science workshops were run with local schools, lectures given to local universities, and a large, well-attended CCS forum event held annually. The project also gained extensive supportive coverage in local media. There is limited experience with outreach for CCS projects in China, although a few mainly EOR-based demonstrations have reached advanced stages of planning and a couple of sizable storage pilots are operational. Nevertheless, there is growing awareness of the need for public engagement in the country, where some new chemical or coal plants have faced strong opposition. Early work has been conducted by the UK-China CCS Research Centre in looking at outreach needs for the proposed Haifeng coal power project in Guangdong. With educational institutions seen as playing a key role in Chinese society, some work shown here was done with local schools, and print media was also highlighted as an important tool. Although offshore storage may raise concerns among the local fishing industry, CCS power plants are likely to be more perceived as a positive environmental force in China, where mitigation of air pollution is a pressing matter. Lastly, I will briefly discuss the need for broader communication of CCS, which goes beyond the communities hosting demonstration projects and helps establish a permanent place for the technology in public debate over climate change mitigation. alongside renewable energy. This increased awareness and acceptance is surely necessary if CCS favourable policies are to proceed on a national level. Arguably, most national governments could themselves play a greater role in these communication efforts, and thus far some of the most visible large-scale campaigns have been undertaken by Shell in Alberta in the UK, which is shown here on the right. Although the useful role of educational tools in raising awareness of CCS has been highlighted throughout this talk, I was struck by a news story here in the UK yesterday in which school workshops based around the planned high-speed rail link were accused of brainwashing children. Clearly there is a dangerous path to tread in this field. While the slow but steady deployment of CCS demonstration projects will do more than anything to raise public awareness of the technology, the kind of technical and cost issues publicised at early power projects such as Boundary Dam and Kemper County, although inevitable for first-of-a-kind plants, can also damage the case and should be carefully framed. One notable feature of recent general CCS communication in Europe in particular is a shift in focus from fossil fuel power plants to industrial emissions and the potential for negative CO2 emissions from biomass power plants with CCS, both of which offer a much more unique value proposition which does not conflict with renewable energy. To conclude, we have seen how a few high-profile outreach failures, largely due to inexperience and regulatory uncertainty, have perhaps exaggerated the barrier of local opposition, with many projects since winning support with more considered communication strategies. Although the local context and nature of the project are hugely significant factors, principles of best practice in outreach should always be adhered to, with active and early engagement, use of trusted sources, and visibly responding to community concerns among the most important of these. Many projects have focused particular efforts on local authorities who should play as active a role in the work as possible. While problems of local acceptance are certainly surmountable, there is a danger of this perceived barrier being used as a political excuse to avoid CCS in Europe in particular. More obviously acceptable projects such as use of offshore storage in the North Sea should lead the way in this respect, and wider familiarity and acceptance of more contentious projects will likely follow. Environmental groups are also not likely to oppose such projects, although applications with industrial emissions will also help gain wider support. Promoting awareness of CCS as a viable climate change solution among the general public is a major future challenge for CCS communications. However, an example of how public perceptions of the technology can change in a relatively short space of time is provided by nuclear power in the UK, where the passionate opposition and fears of 20 years ago have transformed to a passive debate over costs for newly proposed plants. While growing global awareness of the urgency of climate change will help the case of CCS as it has nuclear power, the cost issue is also likely to become the principal battleground for CCS projects in future, and it's a debate which will focus on existing demonstration plants. So that's the end of this webinar, and I'll just pass you back to Benedict to close.
Thank you, Toby. The PowerPoint is available to download from the webinar page of our website. And the next webinar from us will be on water conservation in coal-fired power plants, and will be presented by Anne Carpenter on Wednesday, the 23rd of February. Thank you and goodbye.